Das ist eine Realität aus Blut und Fleisch.
In one of the darkest chapters in history, the National Socialist Party, or Nazis, took control of Germany in the 1930s. They soon plunged the world into global conflict. This is the story of a brave group of Americans and their planes who fought against their evil war machine and risked their lives for freedom.
Dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
Although his Nazi party only won a third of the vote in the 1933 elections, Adolf Hitler became the undisputed leader of Germany. He immediately began to implement his two major obsessions: ridding the country of Jews and building a military capable of regaining the territory and pride Germany had lost in defeat in the First World War.
Wir werden weiter angreifen und nicht rasten, bis wir das Ziel erreicht haben.
In 6 short years, Hitler built his armed forces into the world's most powerful military machine. His troops gobbled up most of Europe using a new kind of warfare called blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Overwhelming air superiority played a crucial part in these early successes. This footage from captured Nazi archives shows the Luftwaffe clearing the skies of their enemies' planes. The Polish, Russian, and French air forces were quickly eliminated. Nazi ground troops advanced under air cover, and by late 1941, it looked like Hitler might realize his dreams of victory. Any hope of checking the Nazi triumph seemed to be going down in flames. The toll Hitler exacted on his foes was staggering, in both military and civilian losses. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was especially brutal. It seemed that every city along the 2,000-mile front was in flames. Believing that their Aryan race was superior, the Nazis butchered Jews and treated the Slavic peoples as subhuman slaves. Civilians were indiscriminately executed by special death squads. The world was repulsed by Hitler's depravity and braced for a mammoth struggle to destroy the Nazis and their murderous ideology.
This is an American air base in East Anglia, on the east coast of England. One of many such bases from which American fighter planes swarmed up into battle against the German Air Force. Planes known as the P-47, the Thunderbolt, a fast, tough, high-altitude fighter with a dive like its name and an 8-gun blast in its wings. The Lightning, the P-38, master of the air in many theaters of war with its long range and concentrated firepower. The Mustang, the P-51, the longest range fighter in the world. Speed, fast climb, quick dive, tight turn. Into these three great fighters, America poured its genius, its millions of man-hours of labor, its faith in victory against the Luftwaffe. And in their single cockpits, it placed these men. Relaxing now, but not for long. At headquarters, 8th Air Force, General Doolittle is discussing fighter protection.
The 8th Fighter Command will give fighter cover to targets and back from the targets. It's desirable that we peel off as many fighters as possible to come down east of the Ruhr and strafe ground targets.
The bomber plan, timing, altitudes, strength, course, and targets reached the Combat Operations Room at Headquarters, 8th Fighter Command, Major General Kepner commanding. A field order goes out. 62nd Group P-47s will escort heavy bombers over enemy coast through target to limit of endurance. The machinery is set in motion. Now comes the briefing for the mission and everybody present. These Thunderbolt pilots are veterans of many missions, so the colonel gives them only the essentials. They are to escort the bombers to a target about 40 miles east of Mannheim, and then proceed to the strafing of airdromes north of Frankfurt. They're given times of takeoff, rendezvous, escort, strafing. The pilots make notes on the backs or palms of their left hands. Intelligence warns them that they may expect considerable enemy opposition today. The Germans have brought in some 100 single-engine fighters. On the field, planes warm up. It's takeoff time for the Thunderbolts. At other bases timed to the escort schedule, the P-38s get underway. And at still others, the long-range Mustangs go to keep their rendezvous with the bombers someplace deep in Germany. Somewhere out there over enemy territory, near or far, in the long route as the bombers go out and come home, each of these formations will make rendezvous at a certain point on the exact minute. The Thunderbolts climb steadily over the channel into hostile skies. Close to rendezvous. And in the distance are the bombers. Advanced formations of an armada perhaps 100 miles long. The Thunderbolts maneuver for their escort position. Each pilot searches the sky, constantly watching for the main enemy attack, which may come near the coast or deep in Germany, or hit-and-run sneak attacks by the enemy's aerial snipers. And then, at another rendezvous point, comes a group of Mustangs to relieve the Thunderbolts.
This is Red Leader. Okay, men, it's time to break escort. Mustangs coming in at 8 o'clock.
The Thunderbolts break escort. They head for home, watching for every possible strafing target on the way. The Mustangs, far in the distance, sweep the surrounding sky as they come in to take the places held by the Thunderbolts. One of the most important features of long-range fighter escort is this relay system. Because of the differences in bomber speeds and the need of much weaving, fighters used up their gas. Thus, the same group of fighters could remain with the bombers only 25 to 40 minutes out of a 6 or 8 hour mission, going and coming. And 1,000 fighters might be needed to keep anything from 40 to 100 on the job at all times. While the enemy could strike with 250 at any point he selected, our fighter groups had to relieve at rendezvous points all along the route. But on the German side, the Luftwaffe was forewarned an hour and a half in advance, even as our bombers gained altitude over England. This captured German film shows how quickly their 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s got into action after a warning. They had plenty of time to mass their fighters at a chosen point of attack and to outnumber our escort at anything from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. They were as grimly determined to stop our great daylight thrusts into their industrial heart as our bombers and fighters were resolved to press them home. Meanwhile, deep in Germany, the group of escorting Mustangs watches every corner of the sky, weaving ahead, above, below, and all around the bombers like a screen of destroyers protecting the main fleet. They don't have long to wait for another rendezvous. this time with the enemy.
Blue leader here. Watch it, fellows. 109 to 10 o'clock.
They get rid of their long-range wing tanks before the fight. Then down they go for the kill. With a touch of a finger on the stick, a camera and 8 machine guns are put into action. Small cameras set on the wings make the record. Too often poor pictures due to gun vibration. But they let you see what happens in the instant of action, as the pilot sees it. The enemy fighters are massing for an attack on our bombers, while our pilots watch every move of their varied tactics.
Yellow light in a blue flight. Looks like they're trying to lay us away from the bombers. Green leader here. You're right. Here comes another. 9 o'clock.
The Jerrys make a sneak attack on our bombers from behind. Gun camera film, captured from the enemy, reveals how they hammer our bombers with their 22 millimeters. A B-17 catches fire and goes down in flames. This one had half his tail shot off, but is still going ahead. We lose another, but they can't stop us. Our fighters, often heavily outnumbered, engage the enemy all over the sky. And this battle is only one of many. Day after day, month after month. Mustangs, thunderbolts, lightnings. Against the enemy 109s and the Focke-Wulf 190s. Our fighters attack, attack, attack. 2 into 10, 6 into 50. They block the enemy's mass assaults until our victory column soars at the rate of 4 to 1. If a missed rendezvous or other misadventure, due usually to blinding weather, prevented fighter protection somewhere, the bombers suffered heavy losses. But no American fighter ever failed them because of enemy odds, however great. Never was a mission turned back by enemy action. Our ever-increasing fleets of fortresses and liberators pressed onto their targets and dropped their loads. And the day arrived when a huge 8th Air Force bomber mission with full fighter escort was flown to Berlin and back without a challenge by a single enemy fighter. But before that eventful day, the Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Mustangs had another mission to perform. Our bomber and fighter losses were strikingly less than the enemy's. But the home front sent us more bombers and fighters and more well-trained pilots, and our fleets grew mightier by the month. However, the enemy's first-line operational strength was maintained also. The great air battle of Europe was still undecided. In February 1944, there was a sudden change. Our fighters were ordered to range wider, to seek the enemy in the air and on the ground instead of waiting for him. And above all, to follow him to his destruction. A gigantic fighter battle raged across the European skies with victories by our fighters alone of 60, 85, over 100 destroyed each day. The fight came down from almost invisible heights to the final decision, perhaps only a few feet above the ground. Enemy warplanes of every kind and in fantastic numbers were splashed all over the landscape of northwestern Germany and occupied Holland, Belgium, France. This was a crucial battle. Both sides were aware of the coming events, with air domination itself at stake. Once again, a better cause, better planning and leadership, better equipment, and beyond everything else, the valor of our fighter pilots gave us victory. Only this time, it was decisive. So many of the enemy's aircraft exploded over his own forest and housetops, or were driven flaming wrecks into the ground. So many of his famous fighter leaders met death at the hands of our pilots that his morale was shattered. His defense plan was smashed. Quickly, our fighters seized their opportunity. Since the enemy did not come up to fight, down they went to blast his planes to pieces and burn them on his own aerodromes all over Western Europe and in the very heart of Germany. It was the most savage and devastating fighter attack on record. Returning from unchallenged escort duty and on many special missions, they burned his aircraft by hundreds from one airfield to another. Intense enemy flak, sheets of machine gun fire from flak towers and ground installations caused us heavy losses. 4 times as many as the same number of fighters would sustain in aerial combat. But our fighters never flinched, and by their courage, faced destruction in single-engine planes only a few feet above the ground, and 500 miles from their bases, until they had smashed the heavily concentrated frontline operational strength of the German Air Force forever. Now that the sky was ours, another great opportunity became ours too. The destruction of the enemy's transportation system that fed and supplied the great armies counted on to repel the Allied invasion forces. The enemy's roads and railroads were struck with the mighty force of air power. These were tense days, crucial days, and both sides knew it. Our fighters, freed by their bitterly won victory in the air, became a dominant factor on the ground. They exploded locomotives by the thousands and burned freight cars in uncounted numbers. No train in daylight hours was safe. No target too small. Even a single railroad car. No marshalling yard a haven. The enemy's desperately needed rail transport system was shattered all over the map. attacked his barges. His oil tanks. Flak towers. Radio and radar stations. Trucks carrying ammunition and supplies. Staff cars carrying high German officials. This one might have been Rommel. Road traffic of every kind and description until enemy convoys could only move effectively at night. What did this mean to the German armies of the West? How did it count on Invasion Day in the Battle of Normandy? The answer is history. Our gallant armies are driving ahead without having to keep one eye cocked over their shoulders. Their gun emplacements unobserved. Everywhere about the mighty battle was and is the flash of American fighters. The Germans see them deep in their own sky and cringe. Our men see them above the grim fight and cheer. There are remembered names in the mess halls. Major Gerald Johnson, a crack shot. Major Goodson, gallant fighter. Major Dwayne Beeson, great tactician. Captain Eugene O'Neill, one of the best. Major Don Gentili ran up a flaming record. Colonel Don Blakesley, great leader of 4th Group. Major Walker Mahurin, one of the first and best of the great aces. Major Bob Johnson and all his victories. Lieutenant Colonel Gabreski with a great career. And Colonel Hubert Zemke, famous commander of 56. A score of victories or more on the records of them all. Duncan, Schilling, Pretty, and all our gallant fighter pilots who in the decisive hour smashed the Luftwaffe and gave us freedom of the air in Europe.
This is the story of an American air operation. One small campaign in the greatest aerial offensive of this war. In a sense, it is more than the story of a military operation. These planes, high in the skies over Germany, were a symbol of the unshakable unity of the Allies in their determination to fight together until victory and peace had been achieved. June 2nd, 1944. On this day, 650 American flying fortresses inflicted severe damage on German defenses along the invasion coast. Farther north, 300 American liberators bombed military installations in German-occupied northwestern Europe. Flak was heavy over some targets. 8 of our planes did not return to their bases. On this same day, June 2nd, 1944, a task force of 150 flying fortresses, escorted by 70 fighter planes, attacked railroad and marshalling yards at Debrecen, Hungary. None of these planes returned to their bases on this day. June 21st, 1944. 300 liberators bombed the Focke-Wulf 190 engine factory at Bosdorf, Germany. An hour later, 800 flying fortresses attacked targets at Berlin, Germany. Damage was inflicted on railway stations, freight yards, and factories. Bombs were also dropped on the ministries of war and propaganda, as well as Gestapo headquarters. Over all these targets, flak was intense and accurate. Interception strong and determined. German planes were shot down. "38 of our own planes did not return to their bases. And on this same day, at about the same time, 155 flying fortresses, escorted by fighters, bombed synthetic oil plants and refineries at Ruhland, 70 miles east of Leipzig, Germany. As on June 2nd, none of these planes returned to their bases on this day. This was not a coincidence, and these planes were not lost in action. This had been decided 6 months before, on December 7th, 1943, when at Tehran, the leaders of the three major Allied powers had declared their complete agreement as to the scope and timing of operations from the east, west, and south. Operations from the east, west, and south. Operations on land, on sea, and in the air.
The USSR agrees to furnish bases in Russia for the use of the U.S. strategical air forces in Europe, such bases to be used for shuttle bombing operations.
Operation Titanic. Shuttle bombing. With American air bases in Russia, our bombers based in England and Italy could attack objectives in Central Europe, the Balkans, or Eastern Germany, land in Russia, refuel, reload, and bomb additional enemy targets on their return trips to their home bases. Operation Titanic, a triangular superhighway in the sky. With shuttle bombing, flying distances from England to some extreme points in eastern Germany and Poland, and from Italy to some points in German-occupied Hungary and the Balkans, would be reduced by a third. Reduced flying distance means reduced danger. For while planes on the shuttle route would have already landed, planes making the round-trip run still have to face flak, interception, or engine failure. With shuttle bombing, strategic targets of importance to the Red Army could be bombed by American planes operating from Russian bases. With shuttle bombing, Germany and the Luftwaffe could never be quite sure where the next Allied air blow was coming from, or going to. With shuttle bombing, the coalition land war, crushing the Wehrmacht on three fronts, would take wings to become coalition air war, and there would be no target in Germany or German-occupied Europe American planes could not seek, find, and destroy. These were the strategic purposes of Operation Titanic. The task of achieving these purposes was assigned to Lieutenant General Carl A. Spaatz, Commanding General of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and became the responsibility of Major General Frederick L. Anderson, Deputy Commanding General for Operations. In 4 months, the new bases were to be selected, constructed, supplied, staffed, and ready for use. A problem in men, materiel, space, time, and secrecy, requiring food, gasoline, bombs, ammunition, trucks, jeeps, steel matting, and more than 20,000 tons of other equipment, to be shipped by convoy from Liverpool and other British ports through the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. 2,000 miles of submarine-infested waters. Then from Murmansk, the Soviets' Arctic ice-free port, by rail. An additional 2,000 miles. Radio equipment to be flown by ATC from the United States to Russia, a distance of 5,000 miles. oil and more gasoline by tank car from Iran and British surplus stocks in the Middle East, 3,000 miles. A task force of expert ground crews transported from the United Kingdom to Cairo through the South Atlantic and the Mediterranean. By rail from Egypt to Palestine. By motor convoy through the Holy Land and Iraq. Then up and over the snow-covered mountains of northern Persia to the southernmost end of the Russian Trans-Caucasian Railroad at Tabriz. Finally, by special train over the Caucasian Mountains to their new headquarters somewhere in Russia. A secret journey of more than 7,000 miles. By the end of 4 months, the bases were ready. And Ambassador Averill W. Harriman and Major General John R. Dean, head of the United States military mission at Moscow, landed on the first American air base on Russian soil. Now, with preparation and organization completed, the task of transforming theory into reality was assigned to the 8th American Air Force, based somewhere in England, and the 15th Air Force, based somewhere in Italy. Early in the morning of June 2nd, crews of bomber and fighter commands of the 15th Air Force were assembled to be briefed for a special mission. A special mission for pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. And finally, a special word of farewell from Major General Twining, Commanding General of the 15th Air Force.
I do not have to impress you with the importance of this mission to the Russian bases. I'm sure you are fully aware of this important event. I would like to mention one thing about which you must be very particular. That is your conduct while at these Russian bases. Be soldierly and neat at all times. The Russian is a fine soldier who appreciates results and one who does not understand big talk. Wish you the best of luck. Goodbye.
At 0600 hours, the bombers took off. With Lieutenant General Ira C. Aker, Commanding General of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, in personal command of the task force, the fortresses left the ground with clockwork precision. One fort every 30 seconds. At 0630 hours, their fighter escort followed them into the air. 70 planes in 17 and a half minutes. At 0730 hours, the bombers and the first relay of fighters made rendezvous over the Adriatic, and Titanic 1 was on its way. If the shuttle route to Russia was equally practical from England, was now to be proved by the 8th Air Force. 0100 hours, the morning of June 21st, somewhere in England, Titanic 2. At 0530 hours, the heavily loaded bombers took off into the fog of an English dawn. 24 minutes later, the first group was in the air, heading northeast to the task force assembly point. At 0800 hours, 2 by 2, the last relay of fighters left the ground. At 0930 hours, flying fortresses and Mustangs made rendezvous high over the German coast, and Titanic 2 was on its way. At 1200 hours, it dropped its bombs on the Ruland oil fields and continued to its new bases somewhere in Russia. That is why on June 2nd, and again on June 21st, American planes did not return to their bases somewhere in Italy or England. For on each of those days, their mission was still unfinished. In a sense, it had only begun.
$1,500 hours. What was left of our target was a good 3 hours behind us. But we were still in enemy skies. and we could see the P-51s that were escorting us all the way in, prowling in the skies above. They called us Big Friend. We called them Little Friend. And it was a very pleasant feeling to have them around. About 1600 hours, we saw our red-nosed little friends pull away. A couple of minutes later, our navigator, the little man with the big maps, made with the instruments, and gave us the good word.
Navigator to crew. Navigator to crew. It won't be long now. We're over Russia.
Over Russia. From the sky, all countries look alike. But this was friendly country. That meant no more flak, no danger of interception. Solid ground not too far away. It meant a new country, a new people. Allies we'd heard about, read about, but never seen. How do you get along with people you can't even talk to? Would we like them? Would they like us?
To greet the task force are General Walsh and General Permanov, the American and Russian COs.
Coming in, Base X looked like any other American airfield. Neat rows of GI tents. Runways dotted with B-17s. Ground crews at the edge of the field, their faces to the sky. One difference, though, the ruins all around the base. A silent reminder that enemy boots had marched in two directions here quite recently.
German military success was fueled by the country's powerful industrial base. British and American bombers made a supreme effort to neutralize this advantage before the invasion at Normandy.
The weather had cleared and the air was cool as the last of June 5th, 1944 ticked away. On the coast of England, 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft were ready and waiting for the men. The men who had trained and sweated and anticipated this moment for weeks and months and years. They all had a score to settle. At airfields scattered throughout the English countryside, paratroopers and airborne infantry emerged from final briefings. To these men fell the task of spearheading the invasion. They headed out to take their positions in the waiting planes. It was automatic. It had been rehearsed this way 100 times before. Over 1,000 planes and gliders moved down the runways and prepared to take off into the night. cover of a fading sky, they converged into a solid formation and headed for France. Over the heavy-laden troop convoys, over the craft filled with supplies and equipment, over the combined British and American battle fleets assembled in the English Channel to form the mightiest armada in history. The long-awaited Second Front was about to become a reality. Carefully chosen tactical points from Cherbourg to Le Havre, the outer ring of Hitler's fortress Europe was suddenly overrun with paratroopers. Strategic objectives were besieged by specially trained, hand-picked men. At dawn on D-Day, 1,000 U.S. heavy bombers resumed the attack on coastal batteries begun by the RAF the night before. The planes were joined by the 640 guns of the warships lying offshore. Fire from the greatest aerial naval bombardment in the history of warfare, the infantry went ashore. Went ashore and proceeded to do the impossible. They established beachheads where the Nazis said no beachheads could be established. Tactical air forces struck out against immediate targets in the rear of the enemy lines. They smashed railroads, blasted bridges, bombed key road junctions, knocked out power and water supplies, and strafed the grounded Luftwaffe. Heavy overcast rose to 3,000 feet, and aerial operations were stepped up. In all, 13,000 sorties were flown by Allied aircraft, 8,000 of which were made by the AAF. The Marauders and A-20s, bombing from low altitudes and flying as many as 3 missions a day, continued the tactical assault in cooperation with the ground troops. been an airman's view of a D-Day, but the war is not over. For every airman flying combat, every mission is an H-hour and a D-Day. Despite the headlines, there is no over-optimism among the men and women pressing the attack. They know that throughout Nazi-controlled Europe and the spread-out empire of Japan, savage fighting lies ahead. The forces of fascism, the forces of tyranny and aggression must be destroyed.
Our forces marched ahead, buoyed in part by miracles like the one you're about to witness.
Invasion. What does it cost? What's the ransom for a continent? Weapons. 18 million tons, 50 million tons. Men. 100,000 tons, 1,000,000 tons. Ships to carry the men. But you get the idea. And that'll be all the figures for a while. And since when did a statistic describe a miracle? For this was a miracle. This invading fleet had no right to be here. The Nazis were waiting for us to land near a port, for an invasion is only as strong as its supply line. What did we do for a port? Well, here's what. Picture of the top military secret of D-Day. We built a port and brought it with us. These are breakwaters topped with ack-ack mounts on their way over. And these steel piers. Sure, you just can't up and build harbors, but we didn't know that, so we dreamed them up in Quebec, built them in England, and towed them 125 miles on a choppy sea. We convoyed harbors to France. Here's the stuff invasion dreams are made of, in place off the Normandy beach. How did it begin? We started from scratch. What do you need in a harbor, we asked ourselves when word came through to build one, and here's how the engineers imagined it. The small arrows point to the seawall of concrete boxes or phoenixes. All the parts were christened in code to fool the Axis. Along the outer ring, to break the back of the giant waves and guard the inner seawall, there'd be a row of steel breakwaters or bombardons. For more breakwater with no extra labor cost, we would scuttle a line of old ships. Last, steel loading piers called Luftwaffes. And from the piers, a road and bridges to the beach. That's how Yank and British technicians planned it. There were two ports, one American, one British. We had sent night scouts to sound out the seabeds, and so we could build our concrete caissons, or phoenixes, just tall enough to reach bottom. When they arrived, we flooded their holes till they sank. And here was our harbor wall. Next, we scuttled some 60 ships, obsolete craft from almost every ally. As their propellers churned their last, we swung them into line. Then we strung them together and set off dynamite in their holds. Weighted with stones, the ships settled solidly at their final anchorage. So well had we planned that they always stood high enough to smash the channel waves, providing quiet waters where ships could pass their cargo to smaller craft. For unloading by landing craft and small ships, we had steel four-poster piers, the Luftwaffes. Churchill had warned that the piers mustn't buck the tide. Our answer, hollow legs. Low tide, the air-filled stilts stood firm on the sand. High tide, they floated. To span the last lap from pier to the waiting troops, we had another unheard-of scheme, a bridge that floated. All this because of a quiet notion of free men, that when there's something worth fighting for, the impossible must be sweated down to the commonplace.
and miracles made routine. Incredible? Yes. Even to Americans steeped in traditions of pioneer courage and mechanical genius. Almost unreal, but real enough to the trucks that roll down the sturdy ramps with their rations, and big guns and shells made in America, on tires made in America. Real enough to the men who are America, and to the 90,000 troops on shore who waited for all these. By D+12, American and British ports together were receiving 20,000 tons a day, or the daily load of a harbor like Dover. The miracle of the ports, fitting climax to the American miracle of production. Once on shore, treads and tires would roll on easily to their assigned units. Getting them there was the crucial stretch. American hands had molded the stuff of invasion, and Allied daring had made for it a path across the water. And no one can say which was the greater feat, the making or the delivery. Both were worthy of our fighting men. The impossible was on schedule. Night after D-Day, an unmapped event, the fiercest gale to hit Normandy in 40 years, struck without warning. Most of a 2-year job swallowed up in a few days. Yet these are the normal fortunes of battle, the day-by-day cost of war, what we must always expect. Months and tons of labor. A tank, say, can be destroyed by flame in an hour. A big gun can shrivel into scrap in a moment. Not only men, but guns, ammunition dumps, tanks, tires. These are battle casualties too. And we will need continual replacements for them as well as the men every day until the war is won. After the storm, only a trickle of supplies funneled through the American port. It became a shelter for small ships. But the British port, which was in a far more sheltered place, had stood the gale and was repaired with salvage from the other. We never lost the head start our artificial ports had given us. Without them, the work of millions of Americans might have gone for naught. But the invasion, that began impossibly on a quiet fishing beach, thundered forward to pound its song of liberty into millions of enslaved hearts. A miracle. But miracles are the least we can do for them. Because of the ports, they're pushing on, backed up by the food and weapons we sent. Supplies that say unmistakably that we back home have done our job, so that they can get on with theirs. And that's all they'll ever ask.